While baking powder and baking soda may seem like the same thing, they are in fact very different, so it's important to know when to use which one. So let's talk about baking soda first. Baking soda is just sodium bicarbonate, and when it is combined with an acid, it will cause a chemical reaction that will leaven baked goods. So what is an acid that works with baking soda? Well, a few common ones that are used in baked goods are going to be something like brown sugar, honey, buttermilk, yogurt, lemon, anything like that. Vinegar is also one. Anything like that that is an acid will combine with baking soda and it will cause the reaction that will make your baked goods rise. So if you don't have any sort of acidic ingredient, then using baking soda won't work as your leavening agent because it won't react. Another tip about baking soda is that it is a quick rising leavening. So it's perfect for something like cookies where it's going to be a quick rise in the oven and it's not a lot of time. So that's something to think about when you are choosing to use baking soda or baking powder. I mainly use baking soda in cookies and biscotti, and I make sure that there is an acid to react with it. If there's not an acid in my cookie or my biscotti, then I will use baking powder. Because baking soda is true sodium bicarbonate, you only need a little bit to make it work. A general rule is going to be about 1/4 teaspoon per 1 cup of flour. Now, let's talk about baking powder. Baking powder is actually a mix of a couple ingredients. It is sodium bicarbonate, and then it is an acid so that it reacts, which is usually something like cream of tartar. And then it also has a moisture absorbing agent, which is pretty much all the time cornstarch. So if you didn't know, baking powder has corn in it. So if you have a corn allergy or you are avoiding corn and you're having baking powder, that's not gonna help with that. There are some baking powders on the market that use something besides cornstarch. One of my favorites is Relative Foods, and they use organic rice flour. I'll link that one in the description. But that is what baking powder is made up of. So what it does is it reacts on its own. So it doesn't need an acid in order to react and leaven your baked goods. So because baking powder is actually made up of 3 different ingredients, you're gonna need technically about 3 times as much as you would need of baking soda. I like to use about 1 teaspoon of baking powder per cup of flour. And because baking powder includes the acid, you can use it in any recipe, no matter the ingredients. But there are certain baked goods that even if they have an acid present, I really like to use baking powder instead of baking soda. And that is because I feel like it produces a more delicate and light crumb. So I really use baking powder in all cakes, all cupcakes, any sort of loaf cake, anything where I want like a light texture. And then I will also use baking powder in cookies or biscotti that don't contain an acid. That way they can react and rise in the oven as well. One of my other top tricks for choosing between baking powder and baking soda is if you are using cocoa in your recipe. So there are 2 different kinds of most common cocoa that is used in baking, and that's natural cocoa and Dutch cocoa powder. I am a huge fan of Dutch cocoa powder. It's what I use all the time because I feel like it has a more rich, chocolatey flavor that's just more delicious. But the difference between these 2 cocos and what you choose will depend on if you can use baking soda or baking powder. So natural cocoa powder still has the acid in it. So you can use baking soda if you are using natural cocoa powder. But if you are using Dutch cocoa powder, it does not have an acid and it can also react poorly with the baking soda, and that can create a bitter or like metallic-y taste in your baked goods. So I will always use baking powder if I'm using Dutch cocoa powder in anything, cookies, biscotti, cakes, and everything. So this can also happen with baking soda if you're using in a recipe that doesn't have an acidic ingredient. So think about if you were making like plain sugar cookies where the ingredients are really simple and it's just like butter, vanilla, cane sugar, eggs, flour. That doesn't have any sort of acidic ingredient. So if you use baking soda in that recipe, your cookies are gonna come out with sort of a metallic-y, kind of like soapy flavor, and that's because the baking soda had nothing to react with, so it also won't leaven the baked goods, but it will also taste a little bit off. So if you've ever had that happen with your baked goods, it could have been because you used the wrong leavening agent. So to recap, baking soda and baking powder are not the same thing, but they are both chemical leavening agents that you can use to make your baked goods rise. I never recommend substituting baking powder for baking soda because if a recipe called for baking powder, there's probably a really good reason for that. But if a recipe calls for baking soda and all you have is baking powder, you could use baking powder in its place, but you're gonna have to triple or quadruple the amount that you're using. And some of my top tricks for remembering to use which one is I like to use baking soda in cookies and biscotti and making sure that it has an acidic ingredient in it. And then I like to use baking powder for cakes, cupcakes, or anything that I'm using Dutch cocoa powder in. So if you follow those couple simple rules, you'll be able to choose the right leavening agent for your baked goods. If you want more baking tips and tricks, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join me next time in the kitchen. I'm off to make some cookies with the baking soda.